Isaiah 53, is the most well-known proof text that Christianity believes to be pointing to Jesus. It describes a suffering servant who, despite his innocence, is rejected and despised by others. Christians believe that Isaiah was talking about Jesus, who, according to the New Testament narrative, was rejected by others and suffered a gruesome death. But do we know if Isaiah had Jesus in mind when he wrote the chapter? Christianity has argued that Isaiah 53 is a messianic prophecy. That is a prophecy about a future individual known to Judaism and Christianity as the Messiah. They argue that since the life of Jesus as presented in the Gospels matches what's written by Isaiah in chapter 53, that Isaiah must be talking about the Messiah, whom they believe was Jesus. But is there a way to determine from the text itself that Isaiah was talking about the Messiah? To answer this question, we must understand what exactly is the Messiah, to know if Isaiah was indeed talking about him when writing chapter 53. Now the word Messiah comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which simply means anointed. In the Torah, the word Mashiach was applied to priests, as they were anointed with consecrated oil when they were initiated into the priesthood. Later in the book of Samuel, the word Mashiach was applied to the man chosen by God as king over Israel, as he was anointed with oil by God's prophet when he was chosen to be king over Israel. Later yet, in the book of Isaiah, the word Mashiach was used for the Persian king Cyrus, but we find no example of the word Mashiach being used for an individual who is to come at the end of the ages. The word Mashiach first started being used as a reference to the one who is to come at the end of the ages, at the end of the Second Temple period, long after the books of the Hebrew Bible were written and after the Hebrew canon was closed. So the word Mashiach in the Hebrew Bible doesn't tell us much about the awaited individual who came to be referred to as Mashiach. How then do we tell when the Hebrew Bible is talking about the Mashiach, if the word itself isn't used for the Messiah? In order to know when the Hebrew Bible is talking about the Messiah, we must understand what Jews believed about the Messiah. But this is problematic as there were differing Jewish sects that had different beliefs about the Messiah. The Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Nazarenes all had their own beliefs about the Messiah. So we must look at what beliefs about the Messiah were most commonly accepted. When looking at the New Testament and rabbinic literature, we find that both agree that the Messiah will be a king from the family line of David. This is further confirmed by the Second Temple text, known as the Psalms of Solomon in Psalm 17. When looking at the Hebrew Bible, we find that David was promised by God that he will establish the throne of his son Solomon forevermore. However, this Davidic monarchy was eventually disbanded when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem in 586 BCE and took Judah into exile. However, God said through his prophets that there eventually would come a descendant of David who will reestablish the Davidic monarchy and rule over a united Israelite kingdom. The prophet Isaiah calls this Davidic descendant the stump of Jesse, Jesse being the father of David. He tells us that this descendant of David will judge fairly and destroy the wicked, and will reign over an era of peace. The prophet Jeremiah calls him branch of David, after his ancestor David, and says that he will do what is just and right, and that Judah and Israel will be saved and dwell securely in his days. The prophet Ezekiel calls him my servant David, after his ancestor David, and says that he will shepherd the people of Israel and be a ruler over them. He will reign during a period when God has regathered the people of Israel back to their land and has placed his eternal sanctuary among them. All these are messianic prophecies, as they speak about the long-awaited hope that the Jewish people had that God would send the descendant of David, who is to become the eventual king over Israel, during an era of peace. And it is a fulfillment of the promise by God to David that he would have an eternal dynasty ruling Israel. With this in mind, let us look back to Isaiah 53. Throughout the chapter, there is no connection to David mentioned. The individual that is spoken about in Isaiah 53 is never referred to as king, a key aspect of all the other messianic prophecies spoken about by the prophets. Isaiah speaks about him as a suffering, despised and rejected individual. In all the messianic prophecies, speaking about the Davidic king that is to come, none of them tell us that he will suffer, be rejected, and despised. It certainly does not fulfill the messianic promise made by God to David. In fact, the only time that it is mentioned that the Davidic descendant would suffer is only if he was unrighteous and did not follow God's commandments. Then God would bring suffering on him, which is actually seen as going against the messianic promise made by God to David. So the textual evidence linking the future Davidic king to the suffering and despised individual of Isaiah 53 is non-existent. But let's look within the chapter itself. Isaiah refers to this individual as my servant. Can we know from this term my servant who Isaiah was speaking about? And if not, who was Isaiah speaking of? The term my servant is very ambiguous, as it is applied to many individuals throughout the Hebrew Bible. Abraham is called my servant. Moses is called my servant. Caleb is called my servant. David is called my servant. Job is called my servant. Zerubbabel is called my servant. And even Nebuchadnezzar is called my servant. With so many people being called my servant, how do we tell who Isaiah was referring to when he says my servant? To answer this, we must look at whom Isaiah used this term throughout his book. In his book, he refers to himself as my servant, the servant of God. But he also uses the term my servant repeatedly to refer to Israel. This fits well with the context of Isaiah 53. The chapter starts off by saying, "To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" The previous chapter, chapter 52, tells us the Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all the nations. And all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God. It is the salvation of his city Jerusalem and of his people Israel, the one Isaiah calls my servant that the prophet is speaking of, as the previous verse tells us. Reading the chapter consecutively, it is Israel, the servant that the arm of the Lord has been revealed to. It is Israel who through the ages has suffered and has been rejected and despised by men. The New Testament itself is evident that Isaiah 53 was originally never understood as a messianic prophecy. In Matthew, after Jesus tells the disciples that he must suffer and die at the hands of the high priests, Peter rebukes him saying that this will not happen to him. Again, when Jesus repeats that he'll be given over to the hands of men, his disciples are distraught. In Luke, when Jesus tells his disciples that he must be given over into the hands of men, his disciples don't understand what he's talking about. After his death, 2 of his disciples express their distress that Jesus, whom they hoped would be the one to redeem Israel, was instead crucified. All this shows that none of them were aware of any messianic prophecy of the Messiah being rejected, suffering, and dying. After Jesus' death, when his disciples continued to believe in him as the Jewish Messiah despite not having fulfilled the prophecies traditionally associated with the Messiah, they looked for other passages in the Hebrew Bible to find confirmation for their belief that Jesus was indeed the Messiah despite his untimely death, as Matthew does with his fulfillment citations. As they came across Isaiah 53, they believed it to be describing Jesus, and so understood it as a messianic prophecy. As Walter Brueggemann, one of the most influential Christian Old Testament scholars, has written, Isaiah 53, in the context of Isaiah, is about Israel, and that the messianic interpretation about Jesus is not clearly evident from the text, but the church used Isaiah 53 to show Jesus. When the Christians would retell the Passion narrative, they would say it in a way that fit with Isaiah's description of the suffering servant, a phenomenon known as prophecy historicized. We find examples of this phenomenon within the Gospels. In Mark's Gospel, after John's arrest, Jesus preached the good news in the region of the Galilee. When Matthew retells this story, he specifies that in Galilee, Jesus left his hometown Nazareth for Capernaum in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali to fulfill the words of Isaiah, that the land of Zebulun and Naphtali would see a great light. Although the context of Isaiah is about Zebulun and Naphtali's conquest by Assyria, and the great light was the destruction of Assyria witnessed by the people of Judah, the Gospels of Mark and Luke tell us that Jesus rode on a donkey to Jerusalem. Matthew, when retelling this story, says that Jesus rode to Jerusalem on both a donkey and a colt, for what he saw as a literal fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah 9:9, but in reality was a synonymous parallelism. The Gospels of Mark and Luke tell us that Judas was willing to betray Jesus for money, but it doesn't specify how much money. When Matthew retells the story, he specifies the amount, which is 30 pieces of silver, to fulfill the prophecy of Zechariah, which Matthew misattributes to Jeremiah. This phenomenon of prophecy historicized happened with the Passion narrative in Isaiah 53. Jesus was put to death by Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea. As governor of Judea, his job was to collect taxes and maintain peace in the region. He would head from his home in Caesarea to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover, a very tense time exploited in the past to recruit members for rebellions against Rome. Pilate headed to Jerusalem during this time, as was the practice by Roman governors of Judea to maintain order. Jesus came to Jerusalem at this time. Having been believed to be the Jewish Messiah by his disciples, he would have aroused Roman suspicions. as several Messiah figures both before and after Jesus led violent revolts against Rome and were put down forcefully by the Romans. Jesus himself had told his disciples that when the Son of Man comes, the 12 tribes of Israel will be ruled by them, his 12 disciples, presumably independent of Roman rule, something which Messiah figures both before and after Jesus tried to overthrow, something which would have been treasonous to Roman ears. Statements like these would have been known to the Romans through Judas, who betrayed Jesus. Jesus, who made a commotion by overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple, would have caught the attention of the Roman soldiers, who were on high alert during the Passover season for troublemakers. Jesus was brought to Pilate, who is described by Philo as a man of a very inflexible disposition, and very merciless as well as very obstinate, known for his corruption, and his acts of insolence, and his rapine, and his habit of insulting people, and his cruelty, and his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending, and gratuitous, and most grievous inhumanity. According to Josephus, Pilate had a number of Jews peacefully protesting the desecration of their law, clubbed to death to intimidate the Jews into submission, and was eventually recalled as governor of Judea for having violently suppressed a Samaritan uprising and murdering all those who fled. Even the Gospel of Luke tells us of Pilate's cruelty. So on the one hand you have Jesus, a man whom the Romans had reason to suspect of sedition, being brought to Pilate, a cruel, intolerant, and corrupt murderer for judgment. The verdict would have been obvious to all, as Catholic priest and New Testament scholar John Meyer notes, that Josephus places responsibility for Jesus' execution on Pilate alone. However, the Gospel writers give us a very different story. Although Jesus did many things the Romans would have considered potentially treasonous, the Gospel writers tell us that Pilate found no fault in him. Unlike Philo and Josephus, who describe Pilate as a cruel and intolerant murderer, the Gospels describe him as sympathetic to Jesus and tried to exonerate him. Unlike Josephus, who says that it was mainly principled men who incited Pilate to execute Jesus, the Gospels tell us that it was the crowds of Jews in Jerusalem who called for his death. Why do the Gospel writers do this? Because they are trying to show that Jesus fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 says that the servant was despised and rejected by the very people he died to atone for, and not merely one of the many victims of Pilate's cruelty. Isaiah 53 tells us he was sentenced for no crime of his own, and not, as the Romans rightly suspected, potential treason. The Gospel of Mark tells us that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, who buried him in a tomb cut out of the rock. When Matthew retells this story, he does not tell us that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin, but rather that he was a rich person and that he buried Jesus in his own grave. This is because Isaiah 53 tells us that the servant was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. Matthew wants to show us that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy of Isaiah 53. When Christian Bibles translated Isaiah 53, they translated it in a way that shows that it's about Jesus, although it was not an accurate translation of the Hebrew. In verse 5 it says, "He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities." The Hebrew word for our transgressions is mipisha ainu, which means from our transgressions. The Hebrew word for our iniquities is me'avonotenu, which means from our iniquities. The mem suffix in the beginning of both words means from. The servant suffered from our evil actions and evil behavior. But Christian Bibles instead translated it as for our transgressions and for our sins, because according to Christianity, Jesus' suffering and death was to atone for our sins. In verse 8 it says, "For the transgression of my people he was punished." The Hebrew word for he was punished is negalamo. The word lamo means to them. It was a punishment to them, in plural because the chapter is about the nation of Israel. But Christian Bibles translated it in singular. He was punished because Christianity believes it to be about Jesus, an individual. In verse 9 it says he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. The Hebrew word for his death is bimotav, which means his deaths in plural. It is not the singular bimoto, because Isaiah 53 is about the deaths that many in Israel have gone through. But Christian Bibles translate it as his death, in singular, because according to Christianity, it is about the single death of Jesus. In verse 10, it says, "Though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin." In Hebrew it says, "Im tasim asham nafsho," which means, if he places the guilt of his life. The Hebrew word aim means if. The Hebrew word asham means guilt. If the servant makes a reckoning for his guilt, he will be reconciled with God and see offspring and have long life. But Christian Bibles translate it as, though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, because according to Christianity, God made Jesus a sacrifice to atone for our sins. Christian apologists, in their efforts to prove that Isaiah 53 is a messianic prophecy, have alleged that rabbinic tradition has always understood Isaiah 53 to be about the Messiah, and that it wasn't until the widely accepted medieval Jewish commentator Rashi that Judaism started interpreting Isaiah 53 as being about Israel. Of course, this is an egregious lie. The first-century rabbi, Yonatan ben Uziel, in his Targum, or Aramaic translation of the prophets, refers to the servant of Isaiah 53 as Israel twice. According to the Talmud, Isaiah 53 is about all righteous in Israel who suffer. According to the Midrash Rabbah, Isaiah 53 is about the people of Israel who gave up their lives in exile. Even the church father Origen, writing in the 3rd century, says that the Jews interpreted Isaiah 53 as referring to Israel. Christians have claimed that the reason the Jews didn't accept Jesus, even though the prophecy of Jesus has been stated clearly in Isaiah 53, is because the rabbis have forbidden Jews from learning Isaiah 53, knowing that it would lead them to belief in Jesus. This is an egregious lie. There is no statement anywhere in all of rabbinic literature forbidding the study of Isaiah 53. In fact, Isaiah 53 is quoted throughout rabbinic literature, in the Talmud, Midrashim, Zohar, and every rabbinical commentator comments on it. To prove their claims, Christians have pointed to the fact that Isaiah 53 is absent in the Haftorah, the reading of the prophets after reading of the Torah on Sabbath. This, of course, is a lie. The Haftarah does not include all of the prophets to be read, but only select passages which are connected to the Torah reading. Even Mizrahi Jews living in Arabic lands, who were never under Christian influence, did not have Isaiah 53 as part of their Haftorah. Even Isaiah 9:6 is included in the Haftorah, even though Christianity has used it as a proof text for Jesus. Christians point to the fact that the Haftorah includes Isaiah chapter 52 and chapter 54, but not chapter 53. This itself does not prove their claims. The Dead Sea Scroll 4Q176, known as 4Q Tanhuman, or Consolation, includes passages from Isaiah that are consolation for exile and destruction of the temple. The scroll includes passages from Isaiah chapter 40, 41, 43, 44, 49, 51, 52, and 54, but not 53. The scroll itself was written the century before Jesus, and so its omission of Isaiah 53 has nothing to do with Christian appeal to the chapter. Likewise, the practice of the Haftarah existed before the spread of Christianity, as is evident from the New Testament itself. Christians, in order to prove their lie, point to the 17th century Jewish historian Raphael Levi, who claimed that Isaiah 53 was taken out of the Haftorah, to avoid discussing the potential messianic prophecy of Isaiah 53. Except that there is no statement by Raphael Levi that Christians can point to, where he says such a thing. Raphael Levi himself, who was burned at the stake for the false accusation that he murdered a Christian child, was offered the chance to convert to Christianity but refused, saying that he lived his whole life a Jew. He will die a Jew. If Isaiah 53 is so obviously about Jesus, why does Christianity have to lie so much about it?